So, hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the procedural features in Unreal Engine 4. And I'm going to be using the Brushify Forest Pack to do that. So, here I am inside the Forest Pack scene, and you can see that this is pretty much just like a typical North American forest kind of scene. I'm just going to jump into the game and run around a bit. Okay, cool. So yeah, you can see that basically the whole scene is kind of covered in all of these little rocks, and there's sort of procedural grass down there. You can actually turn up the density scale on this grass, so there's a little bit more of it. So yeah, and then you can see there's also all these sort of trees and bushes being scattered around. And everything in this scene that's being placed right now is being done procedurally. So I haven't had to sort of hand place any of this stuff. This is all just stuff that's kind of like scattered based off of an algorithm. And it's based off of sort of the slope of the terrain and sort of textures underneath. But yeah, all of these sort of trees, all the bushes, all the little rocks, everything isn't hand placed, it is done procedurally. And of course, results with this can vary. It's all really down to sort of the settings that you choose for that, and you have to make sure that you're not going too crazy with the amounts of the stuff that you're scattering. But generally, you can get some really nice results that can populate huge areas very, very quickly without needing a lot of hand placement. So if you do have a map that's quite a massive map, I mean this one is quite big. It's like a couple of square kilometers, but this you could even stretch it out to 64 square kilometers, or the upper limits of what Unreal Engine is capable of. And even if you're using like world composition to have hundreds of square kilometers, that can be used. These systems can be used with that as well. So yeah. So I'm going to just go over how that works and what you can actually do to make your own sort of procedural systems like this that populate huge areas almost instantly. So first step I'm going to delete all the current foliage. And you can see that without all of the foliage, I've got a sort of general height map. There are a couple ones I kind of placed manually there. I'm just going to go in and delete those too. And yeah, you can see that I've basically got this sort of terrain underneath, and this was created using the sort of typical Brushify technique, which is the sort of alpha brushes, these kind of terrain stamps, which you've seen me using before in my other videos, and those are basically used to create this sort of nice erosion effects here for these sort of canyons. And then on the ground here you can see there are all of these little details, gullies that are forming. And on top of that, I've of course got the Brushify automatic texture being applied, which if I bring this over here, you can see I've got the Brushify landscape material applied. And this is just a landscape material like any other Brushify landscape material that I can go in and I can start to paint directly on there, all my different biomes and stuff. So yeah, the great thing with these kind of packs is it's just like with all of my packs, you can go in there and start painting different biomes over the top. Beach, desert, forest, snow, basically whatever you want. And of course it's going to, snow. Of course it's going to automatically texture that and give you really interesting results that yeah. And of course right now I'm just going crazy with it and like making the strength really high, but of course if you lower the strength you get some really nice soft blends and transitions going on there between the different biomes. So yeah, it's really cool for that kind of thing, just be able to use the landscape shader. So that's for the landscape and actually making this kind of backdrop or sort of undercoat to the entire terrain. Brushify pretty much has you covered there. So if you've got this like grass, so if I just put a grass over everything, and there's also a variant of the grass called grass dry, which is kind of like a yellowish colored one. That's kind of cool. So yeah, for the underlying terrain, that's pretty much how I'd do it. I would start out by just covering everything with grass by just filling out the whole thing. And then, you know, in some areas you might want to have some areas that are like a little bit more, yeah, just bring out some areas with the dry stuff. So maybe in the center of some of the canyons, it's more like dry in there. But you know, you can spend however long you want on the actual landscape painting, and you know, even blend in multiple biomes and things. But that's all up to you. You know, if it depends on the need of your project, basically. So if you would have something like that as a base, so if you would, so yeah, just for now I'm just going to fill everything with grass, and yeah, that takes care of that underlying terrain. So the next step is to try and figure out how we're going to do the procedural spawning. So in order to do procedural spawning, you're going to need to activate a couple of options in your settings. So you're going to need to activate a couple of settings. So you go up to, so if you go up to here and go edit and then go project preferences. Now inside of the project preferences, we're going to search procedural. And you can see here, mine's already ticked, but right here there's a setting called Procedural Foliage. So make sure you tick that setting and restart Unreal Engine, and then you're going to be good to go for Procedural Foliage. Once that setting is ticked and you're inside of Unreal, you can go to the Modes panel here and search in Classes and just type Procedural, and it will come up with the Procedural Foliage volume and another volume called the Procedural Blocking volume. Now I'm going to drag and drop the Procedural Foliage volume, and I'll just show you what that is. So the Procedural volume, Foliage volume, is just basically a sort of cube that allows you to pick a foliage spawner. You know, you can change the size of this cube and in different ways, but this is pretty much the cube that dictates where the foliage is going to spawn. So if I put this down here right now, and I'm just going to adjust the size and sort of slot it into the terrain there. And here you can see that it's asking for a foliage spawner. So if I go up to the, if I click the little magnifying glass, go into the content browser, Brushify already comes with several procedural foliage spawners that are already built and sort of ready to be used. So if you purchase this forest pack, I've already set up a folder called Brushify Procedural, and inside of there you can find all these various foliage spawners. So if I go in Procedural Foliage, you can see there's one here, it's called Trees Green, and I'm just going to drag and drop that into there, and now I've got Trees Green selected. I can hit Simulate, and yeah, let me move that out of the way. So if I just adjust this a little bit more, let's make it a bit bigger, because it's always got to be a little bit. Okay, cool. So now I've just spawned within that small area some foliage. Hit Resimulate again, and you can see that as I sort of move this area around and then hit Resimulate, it's basically keeping the pattern of the sort of distribution pattern that's in it, that's already set up within that spawner. So yeah, you can see how it's kind of like adhering to that pattern every single time. So the trees that are already simulated aren't really moving around. So the great thing about this is, of course, you can change the scale of this so that it basically covers the entire map. So if I set the settings here to 20,000, or say maybe 50,000, and okay, great. Now I hit Simulate again. Now you can see it's simulated for pretty much like my entire map. So let's move it a little bit more central. But yeah, over a massive area. And of course you can make these procedural volumes as big as you want. So here's one I made earlier, which I'm just going to delete that one now. And here's one I made earlier, which sort of covers the entire terrain. So I'm just going to give that trees green again and then hit resimulate, and bam, you can see now the entire map is covered in these nice little trees. So yeah, it's a really great way, you know, if you just want out of the box to have something. The forest pack kind of has all of this stuff included. So in this video, yeah, and I also have another one for rocks. So if I simulate the rocks, yeah, you can see that that's kind of simulated rocks that are coming, you know, simulated rocks that are basically attacking the slopes and sort of covering the entire map, but generally they're just attacking certain angles and slopes, so they fill in there. So okay, I'm going to tell you how. So next I'm going to go into the sort of details about how the actual procedural spawning is set up and how you can tweak it and change it to get your own results. So first I'm going to start off with the trees. So this one I'm just going to get rid of the rocks there by unticking allow landscape and hitting resimulate. So a quick note on these settings here, there are sort of 2 or 3 settings inside of the procedural foliage spawner. One is one that actually allows it to spawn on top of static meshes. The other is that it allows to spawn on the sort of landscape. I can show you how that works right now. If I get one of the Brushify cliffs, let's try this one. Okay, I'll just make that a bit bigger, and I've just kind of put that down. And let's see if we can make a couple of trees that spawn on top of there somehow. So if I make sure we have allow static mesh ticked, and then let's maybe move it to where the trees would usually spawn, because they've got a kind of distribution already set up. So yeah, you can see now that instead of spawning on the landscape, they're actually spawning on top of that big rock there, which is really useful if you don't want to have to, you know, if you don't want trees to be kind of clipping inside of your cliffs. Obviously this cliff is placed a bit crazy, but you know, if for example, if I would place this cliff inside of here. Oh, and that's another thing to notice is as I move the cliff around, they're automatically, because they are placed on it as foliage, they're automatically moving with it, which is kind of nice, you know, in case you want to move like a lot of stuff. So yeah, if I move it like there, then let's resimulate. So yeah, you can see here it's now sort of nicely updated that, and there's even like bushes and stuff growing on the sides of that cliff, you know, which I didn't really need to place myself or anything. And now I can just jump into the game and let's have a look. Yeah, so I can just walk around on top of there. So yeah, totally procedural. I didn't really have to do anything there. And you know, you can see how this would work really nicely for you know, for an MMO. The sort of typical thing that you would do would be to, you know, you would start by populating your entire terrain with, you know, like basic cliffs. So like here where you've got some kind of ugly looking flat terrain, you would take your cliff and kind of slot that in, and you basically let the geometry do the work in terms of making it actually look good. And then once you're happy with that layout, you can then go in and add the procedural level, the procedural detail on top, and that's really just like ticking static mesh and then hitting generate. And now you can see I've got these kind of extra rocks that have all nicely appeared to kind of supplement, to kind of supplement the cliffs I've already placed. So yeah, just to show you again without how it looks, and then again resimulate, and you can see with. So yeah, just adding a few little extras here and there. Another thing that's really awesome is that if you go into the actual, if you go into the foliage panel and you go into sort of select mode, you can still select the sort of various foliage that was procedurally spawned. Like this one, for instance, this here is actually procedurally spawned one, procedurally spawned rock. I can now take that, and if I don't like that it was hanging off the edge there, maybe the procedural spawner messes up and it makes it hang a bit too far off the edge. In that case, it actually wasn't too bad, but imagine if it was coming off that edge like this, and I would be like, oh, procedural spawner is messed up. Well, it's simple enough just to drag that and sort of bring it back in, and there we go. I've kind of fixed that issue really quickly. And on an MMO where you've got lots and lots of world to kind of detail out, you don't have all day. That kind of procedural that ability to kind of do a procedural generation on everything, and then just fix up a few little bits here and there. That's really invaluable. So yeah, just being able to go in and edit those things after the fact. Same thing goes with the trees. If you don't like how a tree is, perhaps it's on a rock in a funny way, or perhaps it came in a strange location, you can of course hand place those, and you've even got like scaling and rotating still as well. So still a lot of control even after you've done the procedural generation. So next I'm going to actually start tweaking some of the procedural settings and I'm going to use the tree spawner to do that. So I'm going to come over here to trees green, hit the magnifying glass, and that'll bring me to that folder that I've already set up with the trees. So I'm going to explain now how this works. It's very simple actually. It's really not that intimidating or something. It's really like quite a straightforward system. Pretty much you have one file that's called the Procedural Foliage spawner, and you can create your own Procedural Foliage spawner simply by going to let me just see which one it is. Yeah, hitting you can create your own Procedural Foliage spawner by just right-clicking, going miscellaneous, and then choosing Procedural Foliage spawner, and then just call it whatever you want. I usually kind of call mine like whatever it is I'm spawning, so rocks or something. So up to you. In this case, I've got one, it's called Trees Green. And if I just double click on that and go inside, you can see that this is pretty much just a sort of list of all of the different foliage that it's going to be spawned. And each one in this list is just linking straight to various foliage types. So foliage types are basically just another file that references the mesh, and also a few different settings for sort of the rules of the distribution. So basically this is just a list of what foliage is going to be spawned, and then inside of each one is the mesh that foliage is using and the rules for the distribution. So that's things like the angle that it spawns on, and so you've got lots of advanced settings for sort of clustering and stuff. I'll go into those in a second. And then yeah, of course there are some various settings for the amount of sort of density and based on tiles, but generally I would say leave these settings up here at their defaults, and probably best not to play around with those, because you can of course really tank the system by putting procedurally generating way too many meshes. So yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the various settings and sort of explain what they do. So I'm going to close down the list now, and I'm going to go into the foliage types folder, and I'm just going to go into the let's try a particular kind of tree, and we're just going to change how that tree is distributed. So for instance, the cedar trees, I'm just going to select all the cedar trees, large, medium, and small. I'm going to go into edit, and here you can see that because we're editing multiple foliage types at the same time, which it's really great that that's possible, because it means we can sort of change multiple trees or multiple foliage pieces all at once. So because that's the case, I can see that it's got multiple values on the meshes. That means it's all three different meshes, the large, medium, small, all selected. And yeah, and here I can start to see all of the different settings related to those trees. So you can see right now they're all set to the same thing. If they weren't all set to the same thing, they would have this sort of multiple values flag on there. But what I'm going to try is I'm going to try to increase the density of cedar. So it was 0.3 before, now I've changed that to 2, and I'm going to regenerate. And now you can see that it's just gone absolutely crazy and covered the entire map with these cedar trees. Which actually looks really, it actually looks really, really cool. If I go into the forest now and let's have a look how dense that is. Wow, it's like a really spooky forest that's going on there. But of course, you know, having so many trees is probably not going to be so amazing for performance. I mean, these are very light trees and everything, so you know, if you have a powerful machine, it's not going to do too badly. But generally, it's better to keep it something more reasonable. So I usually set mine to like 0.3. That usually gives sort of a nice clustered look of just, you know, different trees in different places. But you know, for instance, if I were to set that up to sort of 2, then this is probably a good example of, you know, to show how the angles work. So I've set that back to 2 now, and you can see the ground slope angle. So if, for instance, if I wouldn't want any trees growing on slopes, I could change that to from 25 degrees to just 5 degrees. Now they will only spawn from sort of 0 to 5 degrees. So you can see that that's now, yeah, they're like now spawning just in the middle of the valleys where it's flat, and on the tops of the hills where it's flat. I don't think that's a very natural look, so usually I try and maybe use it the other way around, like trees are only spawning on the slopes. And then now you can see they're only ever spawning on the slopes there. Which also I think looks quite cool actually. And then of course, you know, you can decide where you limit the maximum threshold. Like if you still want some cliffs to sort of shine through, you can do that as well. Kind of thin it out there, still have some cliffs. So yeah, I'm just going to set this back to the default, which was 0 to 25, and then hit resimulate. And this is really just a case of, you know, tweaking the settings, seeing if you like the look, and then, you know, hitting resimulate, sorry, tweaking the settings, hitting resimulate, seeing if you like the look, tweaking the settings again. So it's a bit arduous, it takes a long time, but, you know, once you've got the spawner looking good and looking the way you want it, you know, it's really sort of like a, yeah, it can really speed up your workflow. So yeah, let's see if I can make something else cool. I'll just kind of go through all of these. So next I'm just going to kind of go through all these different settings and show you what they do. So ground slope angle, that's basically the angle at which things spawn, which I just showed you. There is a setting here for landscape layers. Now what this does is it actually lets you spawn on only a certain landscape layer. So for instance, if I would now create, if I would now paint down, let's say a desert area, and then hit sort of, yeah, if I now hit resimulate, you'll be able to see that those trees have now disappeared from that area there. And the more that I actually increase the tool strength and really sort of go crazy with that painting, the more assets won't even spawn on there. So yeah, now you can see it's just, yeah, completely blank. There's just nothing spawning on there. And you know, vice versa, you can also create different spawners that only affect the desert. So you know, with Brushify, I actually have already got some spawners which are basically just for spawning on the desert. So you know, if I switch this from trees green to let's see, I think trees dry will only spawn on the desert areas. So if I switch that and hit resimulate, it's only going to spawn on the desert. So you know, if you would then duplicate, and the good, you know, the good thing is, like, this means that you can have different assets for the desert biomes and different assets for the grass biomes, for instance. So it's really, really powerful. and yeah, and it lets you really go crazy. So like here, for instance, Cliffs Desert. This is going to spawn a bunch of like rocks. So yeah, you can see these rocks are orange colored rocks, whereas these ones that were spawned here already, those were gray rocks. So if I now respawn my rocks for the Cliffs Grasslands rocks, these normal grassy Grasslands rocks, those won't appear on the desert anymore. So now I've automatically got these desert rocks, and then if I go to the grassland area, I've got all these correctly textured gray rocks, and that's all automatically being done by these procedural spawners just because they're correctly set up with that function. You know, so if I go inside of here, you can see that it's, you know, the same rock but with a desert material applied, and in the landscape layers, that same function I just showed you, it has desert selected. And that's really just how it works. It's just whatever you type in here, if it matches this name right here, desert, just type desert. If you want it to spawn on grass dry, type grass dry. If you want it to spawn on grass, type grass. And you know, and that's right here. I just want these ones to spawn on the grass, these cedar trees. So I just typed in grass here, and that's how that works. Yeah, and by the way, I know this is quite complicated stuff, so if you guys have any questions, just, you know, drop it in the YouTube comments below. So yeah, if you have any questions about this, just send me a message in the comments below, or go to brushify.io, and there is a contact box right at the bottom of the page. Just put your name and give me your email, and type me a message right there. And I'm usually very quick to respond to those because it goes straight to my sort of personal email. And yeah, I think I can usually get to the bottom of most of you guys' issues. So please do that. Yeah, so going down the list, we start to get into some even more complicated settings. Right here is, so I'm just going to close a few things down so I can concentrate more on these. And I'm just going to select my trees spawner again. Okay, trees green. There we go. Great. So now we have trees green selected again. I'm going to hit simulate once more just to get the trees back. And yeah, okay, perfect. So you've got a couple of different things. Collision radius. This is basically, so this is where things start to get really complicated. This procedural system is really sophisticated, but it can be quite unwieldy. There are quite a few things that aren't really supported yet. Like there are quite a few bits of functionality that aren't really supported yet, but for the most part, the system is really, really powerful. The way that it works is, I mean, it's pretty much coming up with sort of a scatter, a general scatter of locations. But then with each scattered object, there's also a sort of shade or a sort of like extra radius around that object where other objects are allowed to spawn. And so that would be this sort of collision radius. So if I turn this down, so let's go crazy and just turn this down to like 25, it can start to be that trees can spawn really, really close to each other. If I turn this up, maybe like 200, you see that suddenly trees are spawning less densely next to each other. And so this is it's a different function to this sort of like overall, you know, density of the sort of seeds that are scattered. Maybe I can explain with, you know, paint a little bit easier, you know, how this works. So yeah, let's just try and explain how this works. So collision radius would be something like, and this is just my understanding of how it works. I'm not sure if it's technically true, but collision radius would be something like this kind of thing. So initially when the procedural spawner spawns some stuff, it's got all of these different sections here. Collision radius is a radius around these objects, which is always pretty much the same. It's always the same. Which means that if another object goes in here, that one won't work. It won't get spawned. If another object is outside of that collision radius, it will get spawned. So, I mean, it's a bit of a crappy diagram, but hopefully you understand what I mean. Now here's where things get a little bit more complicated. There's also a different parameter called the shade radius, but I don't think this one really matters unless you click can grow in shade. So generally you can just pretty much ignore this, as long as this one is, yeah, as long as this one is unticked, you can pretty much ignore shade radius. I think what this is to do with yeah, basically spawning it. I think it's possibly something to do with spawning meshes in the shade of other meshes. So, and by shade I mean like a sort of radius around each one. But yeah, basically I would just leave that alone if you're not really sure what it does. There is some Epic documentation about it, but it's a bit unclear to me what that actually does, what it means. But so far I haven't actually had to use it, and I think, to be honest, it's probably sort of overcomplicating things a little bit. So other things that you've got this sort of clustering settings, which are really useful, which is how I'm sort of getting these sort of nice clusters of trees here that, you know, they're not just like this massive bulk of forest. It's like every little tree is growing in small clusters, and you can tweak that by changing these settings here. So for instance, the number of steps, if we change the number of steps, this will be sort of how thick the clusters actually are, how many steps, how many times they're sort of each time the cluster is actually propagated. You've also got the sort of general density of these clusters over the entire map, which you can change initial seed density, and that's how sort of pervasive they are across the entire distribution. I usually keep mine a little bit lower just because I don't want to have so many trees. Average spread distance. This is basically within the clusters themselves. If you see how all of these trees are kind of put together and they're quite clumped together, if I change that to a higher value and hit resimulate, you'll see that they're kind of spreading more apart. If I really pump the value up, this is in meters as well, so it's sorry, this is in centimeters as well, so it's like if you really want to go crazy with it, and now you can see that there's more spread out. Now you can see that there are sort of more, the cedars are now getting more sort of spread out. So I'm just going to revert those back to how they were. And the number of seeds per step, this is just, you know, after that sort of initial seed was put down, you know, how many more offshoots of that seed can there be. So now you can see that I've got like ridiculously, because there's so many seeds per step, you know, this one clump here is basically a step, and this one clump here actually represents like 3 steps, you know, so this is like 3 of these steps, and then in addition to that, it's sort of multiplied by, every step is multiplied by 10. So if I set this down to like 1, you can see there's basically almost no cedar trees there. There's just like 1, 2, where's the other one? Should be a third one in there somewhere. Oh yeah. But yeah, you can see that because there are only, it might have been collided away, but yeah, you can see that this is the amount of cedar trees that are then spawned. So it's, each step is a tree, and then there's another one that's a multiplier of that. So usually that one's set to 3. Yeah, and there we go. The distribution seed, this is just sort of a random number, type whatever you like, and then you get a completely different distribution, you know, just in case you get something that's like you don't like, for instance, some certain area, and you think, oh, this just doesn't look right, it doesn't look good, Max initial seed offset, this is just something that you can, it lets you basically just change the offset of the entire distribution. So if you just hit 500, regenerate, you can see it's just kind of changing how far, it's just kind of scrolling the whole thing across. So you go really crazy, like 10,000. Really just scrolls the whole thing across. It's like a tiling, sorry, like an offset. Yeah, and so the growth settings, the age I really would just leave it to the default, which is 10, and that's that's going to basically just make sure that your scales stay in check. And the one I would really recommend to use more is the procedural scale, and this is just basically how big can your tree get, how small can it get. So if you go 1 to minimum, maximum 1, all your cedar trees are going to be, as you can see here, they're all the same size. If I change that to 2, you'll get some that are big, some that are small, and there'll be a nice sort of a variation, a sort of distribution of different heights, which is really nice. So yeah. And those are, so those are just sort of like the main things that you can play around with here in the procedural spawner. I encourage you to just try different values and see what works for you. I think that generally, the actual procedural spawning procedural spawner setup usually takes a bit of time. Maybe you can play around for half an hour, get the right settings. But once those are done, you'll be in a position like I'm in, where I've kind of got all of these different procedural spawners that are kind of ready to go, and ready to sort of start blasting out huge areas of terrain for my games. So yeah, and again, just gonna jump in game. I just love how quickly you can come up with cool little worlds without having to spend so much time dressing up all the little details. And I'm hoping I can hoping that I can get even more sophisticated with this in the future, and make sure that it's make it even more realistic and accurate, and improve all the rules of these. But I'm going to be kind of evolving this with Unreal Engine as best I can, trying to keep up with their technology. And of course, these assets are just sort of simple assets that come with Brushify. But I'm sure that you can start using your own assets, but obviously you can start using your own assets, or use some sort of more higher-end assets like megascans or photogrammetry, which it should look even better than these sort of simple substance-made rocks. So yeah, I totally recommend that you try this tool and play around with it. I think that the forest pack here is a pretty cool basis for just showing how it works and how you can kind of set everything up while it still remains really performant. So as a sort of basis or a skeleton to start working from. Yeah, I think this is a really great first step. If you're new to making games from Unreal, or even if you're just working to a really tight deadline, and you need all the shaders and stuff already set up and performant and looking good. So if in this case, like, you can see that my overdraw and stuff for this level is really low. It only gets really bad if I start looking at all these particles. But yeah, generally all the trees and stuff are they're not causing any problems with frame rates, and yeah, I'm usually having frame rates in sort of hundreds of FPS. So yeah, again, let me know if you have any questions at all, and if you do, use the contact box on brushify.io, or give me a comment in the comments below. So one more thing to say is that all of the tools and assets that you've seen in this video are all included in the Brushify packs that you can buy from the Unreal Engine marketplace. So if you just go to w.brushify.io, hit Get Brushify Now, it will take you to my full product catalog. I have a bunch of different packs. I've got a forest pack, which is what you saw in this video. I've got a dunes pack, cliffs pack, volcanoes, desert mountains, grasslands, mountains. I'm at the moment working on a canyons pack, and I'm trying to get out, packs all the time, which kind of, they still use the same infrastructure, they still use the same sort of shaders and everything, and I'm just kind of growing off of this procedural infrastructure that I showcased in this video. So any of these packs, they can all be used in this way to quickly build Unreal Engine environments. So if you guys really want to support me, please, by all means, buy a pack. Another way that you can support me is through Patreon. This is something I just recently launched, which allows you to become a patron of mine and donate, something very, very small, like $1 a month. And that really will help, to sort of contribute to, me building out Brushify, adding more packs, creating more tutorials and more content for you guys. Another thing that I also offer is a sort of consultation service, which is really something that, if you're a game developer and you're building your game and you really need some sort of specialist expertise, some advice from me, then I offer a consultation service. It's like one-to-one feedback. And that means, I'll help you guys with getting your stuff sort of set up. If you have any problems, you'll be able to, come directly to me, and I'll help you even by like screen sharing and making sure that if you get stuck with something, we can figure it out. So yeah, if that's something that's appealing to you, then yeah, you can check that out on Patreon, and the link's in the description below. So thanks, guys.